Our next presenter is Dale Suford Navarro. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2023, where he double majored in political science and sociology. He graduated with honors, and his thesis was awarded the Terry Sanford Award for Excellence. He is currently a graduate student in the Transatlantic Master's Program, studying first at UNC Chapel Hill and then finally at Bremen University in Germany. So I will turn it over to Dale now.
Hello. Okay, so this little bit of research, it's the initial steps and ongoing research that I'm doing now that may possibly be incorporated into my master's thesis. And this is looking at the intersection of two political experiences in contemporary Europe, the welfare state and immigration. So first we'll start out with the welfare state, and if anyone knows me, they'll clearly know that the welfare state is near and dear to my heart. So I would argue that the development of the welfare state was one of the most radical innovations in the advanced capitalist world after World War II. The state significantly expanded to ensure social welfare and peace throughout Europe. And I'll say that in the literature, there's different types of welfare state regimes that are categorized, but essentially the European welfare state, all of the European welfare states, even the most residual of the European welfare states, are fairly comprehensive compared to the rest of the world, including the United States. Traditionally, the politics of the welfare state was about the distribution of resources. This is the traditional left and right that we know of, small versus big government. The left generally pro-welfare state, the right generally opposed to the welfare state. But as society has underwent significant changes, obviously since the late 1980s and early 1990s, some of this has changed a little bit, and the need or the perceived need to reform or reinvent the welfare state has taken center stage, and this has mostly taken the form of transitioning to a social investment type of welfare state. Next, we have immigration, a very hot topic, obviously. It's a very prominent topic as of late. For example, in 2022, there were 5.1 million immigrants into the EU from the non-EU countries, and this is a 117% increase from the previous year. And since 2015, immigration as a topic has consistently, every year since then, been the #1 concern for European voters in opinion polls. So this then brings me to my research question. How has welfare chauvinism... Oh, well, first, let me back up a little bit. So the intersection of the welfare state and immigration is this concept called welfare chauvinism, which I'll get into a little bit in a few slides. So essentially, I want to know, how is welfare chauvinism by political parties reshaped welfare states? But to answer this question, I have to answer first, what have been the trends in welfare chauvinism over the past few decades? So, defining welfare chauvinism. In the literature, the first usage of the term was by Anderson and Bjorklund in the 90s, and they defined this as the observed preference that welfare services should be restricted to our own. And they were a little ambivalent about what that meant, because it meant different things to different people in different countries. But then some years later, Kitchelt and McGann made explicit this connection between a restrictiveness based on ethnicity and citizenship with the welfare state. And they fleshed out the two dimensions of the welfare chauvinism, which I will go into here. So to measure welfare chauvinism, there are two key dimensions to the concept: the pro-welfare side and the ethnically or civically restrictive side, or anti-immigrant. Essentially, I'm okay with redistribution, I'm okay with the welfare state, but only for certain individuals. So if I want to see what political parties in Europe are doing with welfare chauvinism, to create a supply side or party level measure of welfare chauvinism, there are two data sets that look at political parties in Europe: the manifesto data and expert survey data. And they both have their own disadvantages and advantages. Manifesto data, which codes what the actual manifestos of parties are saying, The advantage is this is the party's own words. This is what they say they want or don't want. But the disadvantage is what they say might be different from what they actually do. And this doesn't take into account so many other things. For example, these manifestos are written way before elections happen, and they don't take into account little minute things that happen during campaigning. So expert survey is when literally experts in the field are asked about these issues and they give their opinions. And the advantage is that this takes more into account and they're much more comprehensive. And you'll see why I think the second method is better in a moment. So I first tried to create a measure with the Comparative Manifesto Project. And as I said, they code entire manifestos, all of what they say, based on different variables of many, many, many kinds. So I looked through the data set and I found these two measures, or these two variables that they measure to measure the two dimensions of welfare chauvinism, the pro-welfare and the anti-immigrant pro-restrictiveness. And what I did was I multiplied these two together to get my measure of welfare chauvinism. And just some really quick descriptive statistics. So this is showing that for both dimensions, the pro-welfare and the anti-immigrant, they've both risen in party manifestos in Europe. What's interesting to me is for the pro-redistribution, center parties have actually referenced this much more than even left parties as of late. Right parties have also been emphasizing this more, which is kind of surprising to me. For the immigration policy, they all similarly have been referencing it more, but as one would expect, right parties have been a little more anti-immigrant in their manifestos. So then I grabbed welfare chauvinism over time for all parties, all countries. And as you can see, it has gone up with 3 spikes. I believe there's 2001, 2005, and 2019. The 2019 can be attributed to the 2015 migrant crisis. 2001 is specifically related to some Danish elections in which even their left parties have become very anti-immigrant. The next thing I did was I mapped this according to party ideology, center, left, and right, and as also would be expected, left parties somewhat limited in their welfare chauvinism. The center has some welfare chauvinism, but the right is clearly much more consistently or welfare chauvinistic. Next, I did this by country, and this is where I get some pause, and I realized there's something wrong with this data, because as you can see, a lot of countries have increased their welfare chauvinism, but then there's a lot of countries, Czech Republic, Greece, Poland, Hungary, that have virtually nothing. And this doesn't square with anecdotally what we would think, especially Hungary, Poland. They clearly got some anti-immigrant sentiment. So this is where I think the disadvantage of using this kind of data set comes into play. So I transition to the Chapel Hill expert survey measure. And similarly, I pick out 2 variables in the data set that correspond to my 2 dimensions. But differently than the last data set, I can't multiply and make this calculated measure because of the way they scale their response 0 to 10. So I'm just going to plot, and you'll see in a moment how that looks. Okay, so first, similar to the last measure, I wanted to see how each dimension changes. And there's virtually nothing has changed. Each one has increased, but is fairly flat. So this kind of suggests that there isn't a rise in chauvinism altogether, that is. So then I plotted by party ideology, a little small here, but it's center, left, right. And you can see that also, as would be expected, for redistribution, left parties closer to 0. Also, I should say 0 redistribution means in favor, 10 opposed. So the left parties are clearly much more pro-redistribution. Right party is clearly a little bit more anti. For immigrant policy, 0 is liberal policy, 10 is restrictive immigration policy. And again, as would be expected, left parties fairly liberal on their immigration policies, with the right being fairly restrictive. So then I looked at by country, and This, I'll just point out that it's a pretty good even split between countries that have increased, or country parties that have increased their per redistribution and countries that have increased their anti-immigrant. But I will say that Greece seems to be, out of all the countries, their parties seem to be most pro-redistribution. And I believe it is Austria and the Czech Republic are the most anti-immigrant, as one could say, with their parties. Okay, so this is where we finally get to our mapping of the welfare chauvinism measure. And what I did was I mapped redistribution on the y-axis, immigration policy on the x-axis. And again, 0 is pro redistribution and opposed. 0 for immigration is liberal policy, and then 10 is restrictive policy. So if I map this accordingly, the most welfare chauvinistic parties would be the ones that are obviously closer to 0 on the redistribution and closer to 10 on the immigration policy. And they would fall in quadrant 4 here. And as you can notice, it's fairly populated here. I'll also say that the green dots are left parties, red dots are center parties, and the blue dots are right parties. So you have a good mix of all of the parties here, even some green dots, and there's one green dot in the most welfare chauvinistic quadrant. These slides, I'll just really quickly go through. And what I did was I broke this down by regions and welfare state regimes. So as you can see, the Nordic countries even have some parties. Oh. The continental countries, they have some parties. The liberal Anglo, which is only 2, they have some parties. Southern also have some, but strikingly, the Eastern countries, which according to that last measure had no welfare chauvinism, here, quite a bit of activity here. And what's also interesting is, different than the other regions, there's clearly a skew to the right overall, which means that most of their parties from the left to the right are much more anti-immigrant compared to all of the regions. So lastly, I just wanted to highlight one country from each of the regions. So I wanted to start with Denmark, which has been such a case study in the literature and welfare chauvinism and anti-immigration trends, because even their left parties have become very anti-immigrant. So in the welfare chauvinism quadrant, we have 2 parties, the Social Dems, which are the left party there, or the strongest left party, and the Danish People's Party, which is the right party that has really taken this as their major issue. So it's kind of small, but these dots here are for the Social Democrats, and these are for the Danish People's Party. So the Danish People's Party is still much more anti-immigrant, still much more welfare chauvinistic. And what's interesting is the Social Democrats, according to this, and again, it's kind of small with the dates, but they have moved to the right. So it's become more welfare chauvinistic, and the Danish People's Party has moved to the left, meaning they've become a little less welfare chauvinistic. This clearly is an indicator that as the Social Dems have had to compete with the Danish People's Party, they're trying to compete. So they're taking on more of that anti-immigrant sentiment. For Austria, from the continental region, we have some parties. I'll also just highlight these 2 green here is their Social Democrats, again, left party. They have actually decreased their welfare chauvinism, and they've actually, in the most recent round of the chess data, they would be no longer be considered welfare chauvinistic. So they've decreased so much that they are in that category. Over here, you have some right parties, which is the Freedom Party of Austria and Alliance for the Future of Austria. And they've also decreased. There's still some in the region, but over time, they've decreased their welfare chauvinism. So then we have the UK from the Liberal region, and they also have some parties in here. These parties here are the Labour Party, and what's interesting with the chess data set is the Labour Party you'll see is green, and red, meaning they have been categorized as center and right, or as center and left. But their welfare chauvinism has also decreased. They moved to the left on the grid and are no longer in the welfare chauvinism camp, which is interesting. The British National Party is kind of like a misnomer with their system, but they're there as well. And then we have Greece, which is a really interesting case because you have some activity there, and you have the popular Orthodox rally right here, which out of all of the data in this set is the most welfare chauvinistic. I mean, they're almost clearly at 10, which is as anti-immigrant as you can be, and almost at 1, they're about like 2.43. So almost as most pro-redistribution as you can be. But they have also decreased in the welfare chauvinism. So this is from 2006, but they're now up here out of the welfare chauvinism grid section. So they've improved, I guess. Last, from the Eastern region, again, quite a bit of activity here, which is not evident in the other data set, which is interesting. But they have quite a few parties here: the Polish People's Party, the Law and Justice Party, which are all really right-wing parties. And out of all of the data, the Law and Justice Party here is the most welfare chauvinistic currently. So they are still classified as welfare chauvinism by this data set. They all of their right parties had increased and moved to the right on anti-immigrant. So in the East, not only in the Eastern region is there this welfare chauvinism, but they're increasing it. So lastly, some takeaways. This is difficult to measure quantitatively. I have found a new data set that might be a little better for it, but essentially measuring party positions is difficult. But if I'm using these two data sets I used, the first one using manifesto data, it suggests that welfare chauvinism is increasing, mostly a right-wing phenomenon, and is mostly in the Nordic region, which is very interesting. The expert survey data suggests that welfare chauvinism is somewhat stable and decreasing slightly. Also shows that it's evident in the right, but differently, mostly in the Eastern region. So that's where I'm at now. Trying to figure out next step, because I really want to figure out a way to quantitatively measure this phenomenon in a score that I can then use in regression, that I can figure out, like, literally, is this doing what I think it's doing? And is it changing and reshaping welfare states? Which I think it is, but I can't quite prove yet. So that's what I have.